recording the lecture. Yeah. So we have been talking quite a bit about cheap talk games. So today I'll talk about a sort of related class of games or interactions, which are called sometimes, disclosure games, evidence presentation, etc. So in cheap talk games, the speaker can say whatever he or she wishes, can make all kinds of claims, and there's no direct consequence, right? But there are many situations where one player can decide whether to and how much information to convey to other parties, but cannot outright lie. So what do I mean? So, for example, take advertising. Yes, there are laws against false advertising. So there's a lot of room for the company putting out an ad to make all kinds of claims, but the company is not allowed to say a verifiable lie, right? So if the company is selling a product which doesn't have a certain feature, the company cannot put out in the ad claiming that it has that feature, right? So messages can be vague but not false. So in some cases, messages must contain a grain of truth. For example, a restaurant, you'll see in various restaurants they have reviews which praise the restaurant, praise their food, and they put it up in their restaurant, right? Either on the window or inside on the wall. They have endorsements from celebrities and so on. So they can put out such information, but they cannot fabricate it. Yes. So if a restaurant critic has not praised the restaurant, they can't make up a document as if they have been praised and put it up on their shop window. Obviously, they will be selective about what information they show, right? So, for example, when movies come out, yes, or a book is published, on the back page of the book, the blurb, you have little quotations from various people, right? So somebody writes an economics book, and on the back page, there's a statement from Amartya Sen and Paul Krugman saying this is a brilliant book. This is a must read for all economists interested in this area. On the other hand, I publish a book, and on the back page, there's a few words of praise from my cousin, let's say, right? Now, 2 points. One is that if I just make up, if Amartya Sen hasn't praised my book, but I just make up a statement and put there on the back cover, I'll be open to legal consequences, right? I could be sued and I could pay a price for that. So I cannot just make up stuff, but I can be selective. So maybe Amartya Sen looked at my book and said, this is rubbish. And Paul Krugman just sniffed at it, and only my cousin praised it. But obviously, I won't put out the statements of criticism on the back cover of the book. I'll select the ones which praise me and put them out there. So I I cannot put outright falsehoods over there, fabrications, but I can put selective information. So that's one point. Now, from this last example itself, you can see that people will read between the lines. People will draw inference which are not literally there on the back cover. So if a movie comes out and they quote not the Times of India, not the Hindustan Times, not the mainstream outlets, but some obscure publication has praised the movie, right? If that's what they put in their ads, then we wonder, why are they putting out praise from this obscure gazette from somewhere instead of mainstream critics and outlets. Must be that they got sort of low ratings from most of the critics. So people who are forming their beliefs go beyond the literal truth of the information presented in front of them, and they think about what other information exists which has been suppressed by the party concerned. Yes, so a lot of inference comes from that. So that's what we are going to study today. Okay, so let me be more specific. All right, so let's say that there's a seller, and the seller is selling some good, and good quality is not known to the buyer. So there's a standard uncertainty or asymmetric information about how good the product is. Now, there are experts out there, right, who do a review, say it's a laptop, and there are outlets like PC Magazine who run their tests on the product and make an assessment of, they give it a rating. So PC Magazine has given a rating to this product, and the company's choice is when customers walk through the door, their choice is whether to show them this rating or not show it. Yes. Or make some claim about the ratings. Now, so we'll formulate a game where the message that the seller gives to the buyer can be vague. So let's say, just to fix ideas, let's suppose that, depending on the quality, the value of the good to the buyer could be anywhere between 1 rupee to 100 rupees. Right, 1 rupee is the lowest quality, and if it's the highest possible quality, then its value would be 100 rupees. Now, when the buyer comes in, the seller can make a statement like, these are the possible values. So, for example, the seller could say, according to experts and their assessment, this product is worth 60 rupees or more. Or he could make a statement like, according to experts' assessments, the worth of this product is between 50 rupees and 80 rupees. That's the range. Now you decide how much you want to pay. Now, so the seller can potentially suppress a lot of information. The seller is not liable to reveal the exact value. Right? There's no law, there's no clause which says that he has to reveal exactly what the expert assessment is about the value of the product. But he's not allowed to lie outright either. Right? If the expert has assessed the value to be 75, he's not allowed to say this is worth 90 according to experts. Then he'll face legal consequences later. So that's the game. That's the game we're going to study. So the question in this game is, what kind of message strategy will sellers adopt? But more importantly, how much information will smart, rational, canny buyers get from the acquire in this situation from the seller's message? Right? Will they get no information at all, or will they get some coarse information like in the cheap talk game, or will they get precise information? Yes, if we analyze this game theoretically, assuming common knowledge of rationality and using concepts like Nash equilibrium, what conclusion can we reach with respect to these questions? That's the focus here. Okay, so everybody clear about the problem we are studying? So this is different from cheap talk, because in cheap talk, there's no restriction whatsoever on speech. Even if experts have assessed it to be worth only 10 rupees, the speaker is free to claim 90 rupees, 80 rupees, or whatever value he wants to claim. Doesn't face any consequences. Here he's not allowed to do that, but he can be vague. He can be vague. He can, if the true assessment is 10 rupees, he's allowed to say that this is anywhere between 5 and 95, right? As long as the true value lies in the set of values that is specified by his message, he is fine. Okay, he doesn't face any punishment. So let me give you the intuitive argument of the first result. This is from the Milgrom Roberts paper. Okay, under certain assumptions, we'll examine those assumptions later. Right now, we'll assume that the true value exists and the true value can be revealed. But so this buyer-seller example, how much will buyers learn in equilibrium? That's about the value of the good. Yes. So Milgrom Roberts's famous unraveling result puts forward an argument which says buyers will learn exactly the true value of the good, right? They will figure out with pinpoint precision what the true value of the good is, right? So the seller, although he can suppress the documents, he cannot present the documentary evidence in total in front of the buyer. The buyer, through process of inference, will still be able to figure it out. So this goes dramatically opposite to cheap talk games. Cheap talk games, as you saw, at least in one-dimensional cheap talk game, this is a one-dimensional game, right? There's only one quantity. So in one-dimensional cheap talk games, we saw that even with a small amount of bias, there's always coarsening of the information. The buyer is not able to learn precisely what the true value of the state is, state of nature. Here, the state of nature being the value of the good, no such uncertainty remains. Okay. We also saw in cheap talk games that if the bias between the speaker and the listener is very high, if their bliss points are sufficiently far apart, then essentially we only have babbling. Yes, absolutely no information passes through, even in an equilibrium played by smart players, rational players. Here, it's exactly the opposite, right? In this example that I was just talking about, the buyer and the seller. Of course, what is the preference gap? What is the degree of conflict between the two parties? The preference gap is infinite. So this is a case of infinite bias, right? Because the action choice here is the price. Yes. Buyers don't want to pay any price which is more than the value of the good, whereas sellers want as high a price as possible. Yes. In fact, the seller's preference over actions, in this case, price, is state independent, right? Whether I'm selling a good product or a bad product doesn't matter. I would like to get as high a price as possible. Yes. So that means that B, which you had in the Crawford-Sobel model here, is infinite. Okay. So what is the thinking behind this unraveling result that I'm talking about, which we'll get down to a model and prove it a little more formally in a moment. But what happens in this example? So the value of the product, once again, is any integer between 1 and 100, right? Lowest value is 1, highest possible value is 100. Now, let's think about the case where the seller indeed has the best possible product. It's worth 100 to the buyer. So if the buyer, let's say the buyer wants to pay a price which is commensurate with quality, not higher, not lower, let's say, right? So suppose the true value is 100, right? So if I'm the seller, my best strategy, at least a weakly dominant strategy, is to produce the document which proves that my quality is the highest, that my good is worth 100 rupees. Because in any other case, there will be some, buyers may think, oh, it could be 100, it could be 99. They'll have a probability distribution of the various values, and they can never pay a price more than 100. If anything, they'll pay a price less than 100 in those cases. So I can remove all doubt, remove all uncertainty, not risk anything by revealing precise information about the quality of the product if I have the best possible quality product. Yeah. Okay, so what does that mean then? So suppose I have the next best quality level. My product that I'm trying to sell is worth 99 rupees to the buyer, let's say. It's not 100, just a notch lower. Suppose I don't reveal that information precisely. Suppose I don't send a message which says it is exactly 99. Suppose I send a message which says it's 80 or above or something like that. Well, the most I'll earn is 99 because the buyer knows if I had the best product, I would have revealed it precisely. Yes. So when I don't reveal it precisely, he eliminates 100 as a possible value. So in the buyer's mind, then the possible value of the product is 99 rupees or less. Okay. So he'll probably pay me less than 99. He'll never pay me more than 99. Okay. So then I'm better off revealing or sending a precise message saying that, well, it's exactly 99, no higher, no lower. Yes. So the highest quality level type has an incentive to send a precise message saying my product's value is 100. It follows from that as a next step that if the seller has the second highest quality level, then also he wants to reveal it precisely, right? Not keep it vague. And now you can see how the chain of reasoning goes. It's like many of these repeated application of backward induction that you must have seen in Micro 2, those of you who have taken game theory. So the 100 type will reveal himself precisely. So as a next step, type whose value is 99 rupees will reveal. And then as a next step, as a third step, type whose value is 98 rupees will reveal that precisely. And so it works all the way down to the lowest quality product, which is worth rupees 1. Right? So the seller try to sell the lowest quality level worth rupee 1, may not choose to say anything. He's the only type who will perhaps be vague. Yes. Or say nothing maybe, or produce no document. He can say, well, my product's value is anywhere from 1 to 100. But nobody will be fooled by that. Anytime the buyer encounters that sort of vague, all-encompassing message, the buyer will infer that it's the lowest possible value. That's why he's being so cagey, he's being so secretive about it, and not showing us the precise evidence about what its value is. And so they won't be fooled by it. They'll take the worst possible possibility, and they'll only want to pay 1 rupee after such a message. So the whole thing, that's why it's called the unraveling theorem, right? Since the highest quality type wants to reveal his quality precisely, all the intermediate quality levels, they unravel, their value spills out. Okay, so this is the main point of the Milgrom Roberts paper. Any questions? No questions? Okay, I'll assume it's crystal clear to everyone. All right, so let me show you a little mathematical model capturing this idea and this logic, taken from the Milgrom Roberts paper. Take the same kind of sender-receiver game. The receiver wants to take an action that is optimally increasing in the state of the world. Sender always wants higher actions, prefers higher actions to lower actions. So the sender's preference is monotonic. So the receiver has the standard, single peak preference. There's an optimal action he wants to choose, which is a function of the state of the world. The sender always wants as high as an action as possible. Now, as I said, there's infinite bias, and the main result is full revelation. We'll examine the robustness of this unraveling result due to Milgrom and Roberts, right? It does rely on certain assumptions, but we'll, after proving the unraveling theorem, we'll take a closer look at what conditions are needed. or will sort of change some of the assumptions and see how the unraveling result may break down in some scenarios. Okay, so the buyer-seller model, nature chooses the quality, which is theta. There's some probability distribution over quality, right? Ex ante. There are different values of quality, potentially. And this is the probability distribution of them. The seller, of course, observes the quality of the product he's trying to sell. The buyer does not. So this is like the Akerlof kind of assumption, this asymmetric information. The seller sends some message M, like in our send and receiver games that we have been discussing for several lectures. Now we'll think of the message M as being a subset of the state space. So of the potential qualities, the seller sends a message saying, okay, I'll narrow down the range of possible qualities. Okay, so one possible message is the precise message that my quality is exactly this. It's worth exactly 62 rupees. That's one possible message. But will allow for other messages which are sets that are not singleton. Okay, so I could send a message saying my quality is between 60 rupees and 80 rupees, any value in between. The requirement, as we said, that outright lies are not allowed. So the message that is being sent must contain a grain of truth, meaning since the message consists of a set, okay, that set must include the true value of theta. So when the true value of theta is 20, I can't send a message saying it's between 30 and 50, right? But I'm allowed to send a message saying it's between 10 and 40. Okay. So the buyer hears the message and chooses an action, which you can think of, how much to buy or what price to pay in the buyer-seller example. The action, as before, we'll call it A. Right? Payoff functions are like this. So the seller has extreme bias, right? For any theta, the seller's payoff is strictly increasing in A. As I said, if this were just a cheap talk game like before, then you only have a babbling equilibrium. Yes. So these are strategies, beliefs, we're defining them in the usual way. Before moving further, let's define one thing. What is the full information action? So for a moment, let's think of an alternative world where there's no asymmetric information, where the buyer can somehow tell what the quality of the product is or what exactly theta is, right? He has, from some exogenous source, he has that information. Well, then there's an optimal action choice for the buyer. Let's denote that as A star, and that A star will be a function of theta, right? So this is, for example, if the buyer has the kind of quadratic preferences that we have been using so far, then A star will be equal to theta. So it will be an increasing function of theta in general. So so that's the definition. Okay. And this has the property that, at the optimal action, so in the Milgrom-Roberts model, actions are a continuous choice. Yes, like in the Crawford-Sobel model. So at the optimal action A star, the marginal utility must be 0 for the buyer. Yes, that's a standard first order condition. Okay, and if U is a strictly concave function, then of course A star is unique, well-defined, and so on. Okay, so the perfect Bayesian equilibrium of this game, of this communication game, has to tick a number of boxes as usual. There has to be seller maximization. Okay, given what meaning the buyer ascribes to various messages, the seller will be choosing a message to maximize his own payoff. Right, so there's seller maximization. There also has to be buyer maximization. So after every message, the buyer updates his beliefs, okay, and then chooses an action which maximizes his expected utility. So these are the updated beliefs. The probability distribution of theta conditional on the message that has been heard, right? So given that conditional probability distribution, the buyer maximizes his expected utility. Once again, none of this is, there's some notation here, but none of this is, it's all standard old hat. Beliefs have to be rational wherever possible. We have to calculate them using Bayes rule. In particular, if there's a message which the seller is supposed to send out in equilibrium with positive probability, then Bayes rule can be applied. And beliefs has to be calculated from the actual strategy of the seller using Bayes rule. So that's the third condition. And the fourth condition is the minor thing, which is, that the message cannot be an outright lie, as I've been saying numerous times. So, so any theta which is not included in the message, remember the message is a claim about a set of possible values. So any value which has not been included in that set can be safely assumed to have zero probability. Yes, because the seller is not allowed to tell an outright lie for that reason. Okay, now before stating the results, let me just write down one critical equation, which is really the key equation needed for the simple proofs. Look at this, what the buyer does after hearing a message, he updates his beliefs and then maximizes this expected utility. Now, this is a very simple maximization problem, unconstrained, right? So the derivative of this thing, this expected utility term, should be equal to 0, right? And that's this. So the probability weighted marginal utility equal to 0. In a world of certainty, in a world where the seller knows exactly what theta is, we don't have to take this expectation because the beliefs are degenerate, right? So there, the condition is that the marginal, the optimal action involves is such that marginal utility equal to 0. In this potentially uncertain world, the principle is the buyer will choose an action so that the expected marginal utility is equal to 0. Right? That's just the extension to this context. Any questions? Everybody clear about the model? Okay, so let me.
I have just one doubt. What exactly would be the action set in this case of buyer and seller? Like will he choose to buy or not buy? Is that the action?
No. For example, it could be how much he chooses to buy. Right. Let's say, for example, create many ways of sort of making it concrete, but let's take the following. Let's say there's a fixed price for the product, right, which is regulated by the government. That's a given. Neither the buyer nor the seller can change it. The buyer's utility from buying the product is a function of quantity as well as quality. If quality is higher, then his marginal utility at every quantity level is higher, let's say. Right? Think of his utility graph. If there's a quality bump, if the quality of the product is higher, then his utility curve moves up. So he has more utility at every amount purchased, but also he has higher marginal utility at every amount purchased. So in that structure, it's very easy to see that, if the seller believes the quality is higher, then he'll purchase more at a given price. So think of that as one concrete example of an action choice, right? Higher perceived quality leads to higher purchase by the buyer. He buys more quantity, right?
Yes, sir.
And quantity, typically we take a continuous variable, so that corresponds to a continuous action choice. And again, it accords with the assumption that the seller wants as high a quantity as possible. Yeah, say he has a constant marginal cost and the price is higher than that, so he would like to persuade the buyer to buy as much as he can. Okay. All right, so here's I'll state two theorems or results from the paper, both quite simple to understand and also to understand their reasoning. First result, there exists an unraveling equilibrium. Okay, so the first theorem is telling us there is one equilibrium which has the unraveling property. What does that mean? That means that this equilibrium has two features. First, the buyer always buys the full information quantity. In equilibrium, for every theta, the message sent out is m theta, whatever the equilibrium message strategy of the seller is. And then we have to put it in the action, the action choice strategy of the buyer, right? So we put that here. So this is basically for every theta, this is the equilibrium action. That's what we have on the left-hand side. The theorem is saying that the equilibrium matches, the equilibrium action matches the full information action for every theta. So it is as if in the course of playing the game, the buyer figures out what the true value of theta is exactly. No uncertainty, no range of possibilities. For all practical purposes, the buyer essentially learns what theta is. That's what this first part is saying, right? At the end of the day, he chooses exactly the action he would have chosen in a full information world where he knows theta exactly, right? So that's why it's unraveling. All information spills out. Number two, the second part of the theorem says that in this equilibrium, the buyer's beliefs are skeptical. That is to say, for every message, if the message is vague, the buyer assumes the worst about the quality of the product, right? In the simple example I was talking about, like quality is sort of this monotone, it's represented by these increasing sequence of numbers. The meaning of this second part of the statement here is the following. Say the seller says that, the value of my product is between, or the quality of my product is between 60 and 80. Yes. And higher quality levels lead to either more expenditure or higher prices, whichever story you want to tell. Now, if he says that my quality is between 60 and 80, then the buyer assumes the worst. He says it's 60. It's not one of those intermediate values. It's the absolute worst among the set that he's giving us, right? That kind of belief is called skeptical beliefs. Yes. It's a belief which will lead to the lowest action choice, either the lowest quantity purchased or the lowest price offered. So that's the general concept. In the simple example about increasing quality levels, skeptical beliefs would mean that in the set that has been offered to you as a seller in this message, you take the worst quality level and put probability 1 on that. Okay, so the equilibrium, this is saying there exists an equilibrium which involves unraveling. Buyers figure out what the true quality is, and for every message, they are as skeptical as they can be. They assume that it's the worst quality among that set. Now, there's a stronger result, which Milgrom and Roberts proves, and I'll discuss the proof of the stronger result. The stronger result puts a little more assumption or structure on the utility function of the receiver. And then, so what this is the extra assumption. Let's assume that U is differentiable and strictly concave in A. Yes. Then this kind of unraveling equilibrium with skeptical beliefs is the only equilibrium that exists in this model. There's no other kind of equilibrium. So we can say, at least if we believe in game theory, we can say with a great deal of confidence that this is the outcome that will happen. The seller will not be able to suppress any information, even if he doesn't literally disclose it. Yes. Okay, so let me prove this stronger result under this assumption. Okay, how do we prove it? First step, this inequality, this weak inequality has to be true it follows from seller's maximization. Yes, sellers are always playing a best response. That means that the equilibrium action chosen by the seller has to be at least as high. Sorry, the equilibrium action chosen by the buyer has to be at least as high as A star. A star is what the buyer would have chosen if he knew theta for sure. Right? It cannot be strictly lower than that, because suppose for some theta the equilibrium action is strictly lower, then how can the seller profitably deviate? The seller can profitably deviate by removing all doubt, right? Instead of sending whatever equilibrium message he's sending, he can just send the singleton message. He can just make his message consisting of only one value, the true value, right? And if he does that, then the buyer will choose the action A star. So in equilibrium for some theta, if the buyer is choosing a strictly lower action, if the seller deviates to this clear-cut singleton message, then he can manage to increase the action from whatever value it was taking in equilibrium up to A star. And that'll be a profitable deviation for it. If as a result of your vagueness, you're getting less than what suppose your product is truly worth 60 rupees, and because of all the gaming and all the vagueness and all these vague messages, suppose you're only getting 55, right? Then you might just as well come completely clean and show the document which says this is worth 60, no more and no less. And then you will be able to earn 5 rupees more. Okay. Is that clear to everyone? Okay.
Yes, sir.
So the equilibrium action cannot be less than A star. Now, let's turn to another condition which has to be true, which comes from buyer's optimization. This inequality comes from seller's optimization. The fact that sellers are smart and they're not leaving money on the table. They'll exploit every opportunity to increase their payoffs. That's where this inequality is coming from. Now, the buyers, whatever be their beliefs, they'll choose an action which sets their expected marginal return. Just give me 1 second. Okay, so the second step of the proof. Yes. So let me say it slightly differently than what I started. Let's look at this inequality. For every theta, the equilibrium action will be either the full information action or more. It cannot be strictly less. Now, because of strict concavity of the utility function with respect to action choices, that means that the Bayer's marginal utility at the equilibrium action must be weakly less than his marginal utility at the full information action, right? Concave utility function. So if the action is weakly more, marginal utility will be weakly less in equilibrium compared to full information. And this is true for every theta, right? So marginal utility in equilibrium for every theta should be 0 or less. However, remember this equation. Buyers, they choose their action optimally, even under uncertainty. That means they choose an action which makes expected marginal utility equal to 0. Expectation taken over the various possible thetas that are contained in the message. So if for some for some theta, okay, so for some theta, suppose the equilibrium action is strictly higher, suppose, right? That means the marginal utility at that theta in equilibrium will be strictly less than the full information marginal utility, right? If this inequality is strict for some theta, the corresponding marginal utility will be the reverse strict inequality, okay? But then if expected marginal utility over all possible thetas has to be equal to 0, then if any one component here is strictly negative, there has to be some other theta for which it has to be strictly positive, okay? And in this summation over various thetas, any negative term has to be cancelled by some other positive term. So that gives us a contradiction, okay? So if there's a theta for which the equilibrium action is strictly higher, then there has to be another theta for which it is strictly lower. But that can't be true, because if for some theta the equilibrium action was strictly lower, the seller for that theta will immediately come forward and reveal the exact value and increase the action in the process, okay? So this weak, we argued that this weak inequality has to hold, and now we are arguing that it has to hold as an equality for all theta values, okay? If this were somehow strict for some theta, it has to be the opposite inequality for some other theta, and that's not possible because the seller will not allow that to happen. So this inequality, weak inequality, holds as an equality for all theta, and that gives us the unraveling result. Questions?
Sir, I had a question from the previous slide, like not the proof, but the previous slide. So when we're trying to say that there exists an unraveling equilibrium, is that only because of skeptical beliefs? Because maybe if we did not have skeptical beliefs, then the sellers might not have any incentive to disclose their actual type. So does point 2 technically reinforce point 1 here in this theorem?
Yeah. Yes, yes, you're right. Because if beliefs were not skeptical, then unraveling won't happen. right? So let's say there's a message for which the beliefs are not skeptical. Yeah. So it leads to an action which is more than the action that would have been taken for the worst possible theta, right? That's what non-skeptical beliefs would lead to. Then that would run into direct contradiction with the first part. So yeah, I mean, they are kind of tied together. They're not sort of two independent things. You require the beliefs to be skeptical for full information revelation to actually take place. So the second part is completeness. Yeah, good question. But the remarkable thing is that this is only possible equilibrium. There's nothing else. There's no other. So if you think that there's a way in which the seller sometimes, for some thetas, is able to trick the buyer into buying more than what he would have purchased if he had known the truth, that simply cannot happen in any equilibrium. So essentially, if you believe in equilibrium, the standard equilibrium concepts of game theory, if you think the world can be understood through the lens of Nash equilibrium and its, sort of tighter versions for incomplete information games, then this is a very, very strong result. Any other questions? So this sort of thing is, related to a lot of regulatory issues. So for example, take the case of product labeling, which is a big issue, right? You have all these new agricultural technologies like GM seeds and GM foods, yes. And as you know, the world over, there's a lot of debate. There are sort of passionate advocates of, passionate opponents of GM foods and GM technology. And there are others who say that, this is all scaremongering, that these things are safe, they're only released after a lot of scientific studies and field trials and so on and so forth. Let me not take a side on that debate, yes. But associated with that question, and different societies have different, in America, for example, GM products are much more common. They're quite ubiquitous, right? You walk into a supermarket and a lot of things will have GM components. In Europe, there seems to be both more consumer opposition to it, as well as stronger state regulation of GM foods. In India, as you know, there's only one GM crop that we have legally sanctioned, which is BT cotton. BT brinjal, for example, has been stuck forever. So one policy debate on this is how much should agribusiness companies be forced to reveal to consumers, right? Sort of product labeling. Should there be a law which says that it is compulsory to prominently, in big type, whatever, announce on the packaging that this food product has GM components? Or should it be up to the voluntary information exchange of buyers and sellers? Just leave it to the market to sort it out, instead of clamping down a law, because enforcement of laws are always costly, right? That means the government has to set up a department which periodically conducts surveys, audits, seeing if firms are following the law, doing the kind of labeling they're supposed to do. If somebody is seen to be in violation, they have to be prosecuted. That again requires resources, it's costly. So should there be such costly informational requirements placed on the sellers? Or is it unnecessary? That's the crux of the debate over there. And what is the message of the unraveling theorem? The unraveling theorem is basically saying that, well, the information will spill out anyway. So even without regulation, sellers who have, if there are lots of consumers who are worried about, they want to avoid GM food, then the market will tend to sort itself out, right? Sellers who are GM free, it's entirely in their interest to announce that prominently on the label, because they want to capture the consumers who badly want to avoid GM foods. So they'll label it, and anybody who's seen to be kind of silent on the issue, their product label does not say that it doesn't have GM, can be assumed to have GM components in there, right? So that way the information will spill out. So costly regulation is unnecessary if you believe in the unraveling theory in this context. Okay. So the question then is, hey, this is just theory. How much stock should we place on this unraveling result? What kind of assumptions of this model, if relaxed, will give us less than complete unraveling? Anything?
So that sellers have to tell the truth in the interval. They cannot outright lie.
Yes, sure. So it's effectively a cheap talk game, then all bets are off, of course. If false advertisements and if fake news, fake advertisements can't be stopped, or the legal system is not strong enough to punish such behavior, then all bets are off, yeah, of course. That's one thing. Yes, that we have already seen in cheap talk games. So we just have to put up the two kinds of games. And then the question for a particular context will be whether all this communication back and forth between the various parties in this market, is it really cheap talk, or is it really this sort of game? Okay. We'll have to make a judgment of that. What else? Suppose at least there's strong legal liability against outright falsehoods. Let's say we are in a legal system where at least that much is guaranteed. Then what? Any other part of the model you want to quibble with, which may not be realistic everywhere?
So consumer skepticism, like it's not necessary that all the consumers would be as skeptic, like to always consume on the margin.
Okay. So you can bring in some so-called behavioral economics, maybe. Now, that's a good point. But now I don't have it in the slides, and I'm not going to discuss it in detail. But this is why I tell you, when you ask me, should we read the papers? Yeah, there's more stuff in the paper which I pick and choose the most, what to me are the central points and the key elements. If you go and if you look at the Milgrom and Roberts paper, and this paper is not that technical, right? It's quite readable. There's a later section in the paper where they do bring in the possibility that some of the buyers are naive. They just literally believe what they've been told. And they show that unraveling happens among the non-naive set. Right. So in that extended model, yes, the naive people are fooled, but it doesn't spill over into any kind of signal jamming for the non-naive people. They still figure out everything in the equilibrium. So as long as the naive people are small in number, right, the same kind of conclusion would apply. That it doesn't make sense to bring in very costly regulation if most people will figure it out anyway, right? So this objection is not particularly fatal, right, to this line of thinking, or this line of sort of more laissez-faire approach to informational regulations. Okay, so let me go to the next slide. And That was point number one. The receiver may be somewhat naive or credulous. I said that if 2% of the people are naive, then the unraveling theorem says that the other 98% will be fine. They'll learn everything. Okay. So that's not such a big deal. At least it's not a knife-edge thing. A second thing is the sender may not have hard evidence in possession. Yes. So a book has been published, and on the blurb of the book, the author's cousin is the only one praising it, as I said. So we are thinking, oh, maybe it's a terrible book because nobody outside the family has anything good to say about it. What that is worth printing on the blurb. Now, there's other possibilities. Maybe others have. So I've written a book, and it's full of brilliant insights, but Amartya Sen and Paul Krugman haven't gotten around to reading it. They haven't said anything good or bad about it. That's why I was forced to, the publisher was sort of rushing it. And so I was forced to put my cousin's quotes because nobody else has read it yet, commented on it. That's one possibility, of course, right? And that second possibility does not say anything negative about the book. So in many contexts, the model that I sketched, the standard Milgrom and Roberts model, assumes that the evidence exists, that all theoretically possible messages containing a grain of truth can be sent out, including the singleton message with the exact true value. Okay, so there exists a certificate, a document, an expert assessment with sealed, stamped, and signed, which is in the seller's drawer, which he can pull out and produce to the buyer if he wishes. That was the assumption. But sometimes the seller is not able to give you precise evidence or documents like that, not because he's worried that it's not in his favor, but because such a document does not exist. There's a restaurant, you're gone to a new place, right, as a tourist, and you're thinking of going into a restaurant which sounds interesting. The menu looks kind of interesting to you, but you're wondering, why doesn't the window have certificates from TripAdvisor and National Geographic and what have you, right? If it's a good restaurant, they should be getting nice reviews from those outlets, and they should be framing it and putting it up on their windows, as many good restaurants do. So why isn't it there? I don't see anything. So this must be terrible. Well, maybe the restaurant opened last week, and all the reviewers haven't yet managed to get down there and tasted the food and write their reviews. That's another possibility, which is which would make these guys innocent. So that's the thing that was ruled out by the simple model that we studied. Other possibilities, like the sender's evidence may be noisy. So the TripAdvisor or the, what do you have it? What are these? The pandemic, I've lost habit of looking up these things too much. Anyway, whatever. So maybe the restaurant critic came down there, and the food was excellent, but the critic had, there was had a fight with the spouse and was in a foul mood and just wrote a bad review for not because of the chef being bad, but just because. So the real world is noisy. So there's no one-to-one mapping between the quality of the product and the reviews that it gets. So what about noisy evidence? And finally, what about other sources of information? So yes, you can learn about the quality of the restaurant by, you can try to learn about it by looking at their own self-produced evidence, namely what kind of certificates they're showing on their windows. But you can also Google, especially in this information age. There are often many sources of information. So does bringing in these realistic elements into the model, all of them were kept out of the model, the simple model that we studied. So will bringing them in change the unraveling result? I discussed already the first factor, and as is shown in the paper, is not too serious a criticism of the unraveling result. Let's study the second one. So I'll show you a simple extended model where we'll see what happens if, with some probability, the evidence does not exist. So the seller may have the best quality product, but that certification, that expert review simply hasn't been created yet. So he's unable to show it. So here's the model. Theta is from the uniform distribution, actions 0, 1. We'll take the same quadratic preference we have been using in the Crawford-Sobel model. The only changes in terms of preferences is the sender's preference is just A, right? So his bliss point is infinite. Now let's assume that with probability lambda, the sender has hard evidence. And here we'll simplify the message game a little bit. Instead of saying that the message can be any subset of the set of possible values of theta, we'll say, okay, the message can either be null, like no message, nothing is shown, nothing is said, or it can be the exact document proving the exact value of theta. Okay, so it's just makes life a little simpler. So S has this, with probability lambda, S has this document which says theta equal to 65. Yes. With probability 1 minus lambda, he does not have that document. His drawer is actually empty, so he has nothing to show. But whether or not he has the document is private information. Yes. Now, so there are two pieces of private information the seller is sitting on: whether he has the document proving the value of theta, and what the value of theta is actually is. So if he has the evidence, then he can send this singleton message or no message. And if he doesn't have the evidence, then he can only send the no message. Now, let's try to create an equilibrium where there is some amount of deliberate suppression in equilibrium. Okay, unraveling is complete. How? Well, let's see if we can create an equilibrium of this sort. There's some threshold theta bar. Okay. If the seller is sitting on the document which proves the value of theta, then he shows it if and only if theta is above this threshold. If it's below this threshold, if it's in a low range of values, he just suppresses it. He doesn't show it. Can we find an equilibrium with this sort of threshold strategy? It's the question. And if so, what will this threshold theta bar have to be? Okay, so let's look at that. Let's assume there's some threshold theta bar. Yes. And the buyers know that this is the strategy the sellers are following, that they, if theta is below the threshold, then they deliberately suppress the evidence. If it's above the threshold, they don't show the evidence only when they're unable to, only when they just don't have that piece of paper. Okay, so now suppose the buyer walks into the store and he sees no message, he sees no TripAdvisor certificate framed on the window. So this is one Bayesian updating he can do. He's saying, okay, what is the probability that this guy actually has the evidence, just not showing it to me? That he is informed, he holds this piece of paper. This is conditional on no message being sold. Now this is just Bayesian updating, right? Lambda is the prior probability that the seller is holding the message. Now, if he holds the message, then the probability that he won't show it to you is theta bar, uniform distribution, right? So between 0 and theta bar, he doesn't show you the message. So that's the probability. Conditional probability is he won't show it to you even if he has it. Okay. So this is one probability, that he has the message but deliberately chooses not to show it. And this is the other way in which the same observation can arise. He doesn't even have the message, in which case he won't show it with probability 1. Yes. So this is Bayes updating. Let's call it pi. So if the receiver sees no message, the shop window is empty, doesn't have the frame's certificate, what is his expectation of the state? Okay. Well, with probability pi, he knows that the message has been deliberately suppressed. That's what we calculated, right? We just called it, gave it a name, pi. This is our calculation. So we'll use this expression. But whatever pi is, with probability pi, I as the buyer, I know that his drawer has the document, he's just not showing it. In that case, what is the expected value? I know that it's between 0 and theta bar, the threshold. It's below the threshold. So the expected value is the midpoint, theta bar by 2. With probability 1 minus pi, it doesn't even have it. Okay, so the TripAdvisor hasn't gotten down to rating the restaurant yet. So then in that case, theta can be anything. So the expected value of theta in that case is just half the prior expected value. Okay, so this is the overall expected value of the product if the seller does not produce the certificate. Okay, and all you need to do now is pull in the value of pi that we calculated through Bayes updating, so through Bayes rule, insert it over here. Remember that the calculation for pi also involves theta. So you throw that in over here and you get a quadratic in terms of theta bar, the threshold, right? Let's call that entire function phi of theta bar. Okay, and now it will be an equilibrium if there is a fixed point for this function. Yeah. If there's a theta bar such that if you plug it in here, you'll get exactly the same value, right? That's very easy to see. That has to be the equilibrium because, you know, if people, if theta bar is the perceived strategy of the sellers, that's the threshold we buyers think they're using, then what is phi of theta bar? Phi of theta bar is the actual strategy that they will be using, right? If theta bar is the perceived threshold for the buyers, then their actual threshold will be phi of theta bar. Equilibrium requires that nobody is fooled, so these two things have to be the same, which means that we're looking for a fixed point when we're looking for an equilibrium, a fixed point of this function that we've just set up. So that's trivial. You take this expression, you set it equal to theta bar, you get a quadratic, solve it. This is the solution. And you can see from the solution now that for any lambda, this has some interior value. So indeed, there is a partial unraveling equilibrium. Yes. What are its properties? What happens when lambda goes down? From this expression, you will be able to see very easily that theta bar goes up. What does that mean? Lambda equal to 1 means the classical Milgrom and Roberts case, right? That means that we all know for sure that the document exists. It's there in the drawer. In that case, we have full unraveling, right? As a little bit of doubt comes in about whether TripAdvisor has rated the restaurant yet or not, right? What happens is theta bar starts increasing from 0. Right? Unraveling means everybody above 0 will blot it out, will show the document. So as you reduce lambda from 1, your theta bar, the equilibrium threshold, starts rising from 0. That means there will be a set of quality levels at the low end who will suppress the evidence in equilibrium. And we consumers won't entirely figure out what the exact quality is. And as lambda goes to 1, theta bar goes to 0. And I think as lambda goes to 0, theta bar probably approaches 1. No, that's a 0 by 0 thing. Anyway, the other thing is the comparative statics, which is that the lower is lambda, the more is the set of qualities which successfully suppress information in equilibrium. Anyway, this is an illustration of one kind of realistic feature in the environment which may prevent unraveling from going all the way. Unraveling is still relevant in this environment, right? Even with interior lambda, some thetas from the high end end up showing the evidence, not just the highest quality level, but a whole range of quality levels put up there. Somebody got a 5-star rating from TripAdvisor, they show it. Somebody got a 4-star, they show it. Somebody got a 3-star, they show it. The 2 stars and the 1 stars lumped together and show nothing. Yeah, that's the kind of equilibrium we get. Okay, so questions?
So you mentioned that theta bar is the perceived threshold of the buyers, but aren't the sellers basing their decisions on theta bar? So how's that like the perceived perception or threshold of the buyers?
No, theta bar is actually relevant to the seller's choice. The seller is the one who may or may not have that piece of paper. And depending on what the piece of paper says about the value of theta, seller is deciding whether to show it or not, right? So in terms of actual strategy, this threshold that we're talking about applies to the seller, is relevant to the seller, right? In this construction of this phi function, if you look at it closely, and just think about it just for a little, what we really started with is, let's assume buyers think there's some theta bar value which sellers are using. Let's say buyers think that sellers show the certificate as long as theta is 0.6 or more, let's say, right? So 0.6 in there is then the conjectured threshold, not the actual threshold sellers are using necessarily. So if that's what buyers think and sellers get to know this is what buyers are thinking, then the question, we can ask the question, what is the actual threshold then that the sellers will be using? If buyers think that the threshold is 0.6 and sellers get to know that, what threshold will sellers choose? That really is what this phi of theta bar function is. This function tells us what is the actual thing that sellers will choose. Now, if these two things don't match, then we don't have an equilibrium. Buyers think they're showing it to us only above 0.6, and if the sellers are, as a result, showing it to us only above 0.8, then we don't have an equilibrium. Buyers have false beliefs about the strategy of the sellers. Okay? So Nash equilibrium requires this fixed point has to be, that's the only candidate for an equilibrium.
Okay, sir.